and we'll have a link up to that video about the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare BIOS update to F4q. And up here in the top left on Gigabyte's website, revision 1, there's a revision 1.1, a revision 1.2, and a revision 1.3. Now, why is that important? Okay, typically your motherboard BIOS updates are done according to the revision of the motherboard. So what we're doing is motherboard revision 1. There's also a Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 card in the package. Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 revision 1 and a Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 revision 2. And we have a video up about that because what's important is when you update the firmware on that Thunderbolt card, all this stuff, the integration matters extremely. It's extremely important. So we want to make sure and get these details and facts right. So we've enabled 2 features. And as we've outlined in the past about the BIOS versions and who's on first, literally, this is a good BIOS. It's a solid BIOS. And we have 2 features. Update the AMD AGESA code. We're not going to get into that. We're going to get into the second part, the resize bar option for the AMD Smart Access Memory. Now, that terminology, we have 2 technologies, or we have 2 different brands of technologies, 2 different identifiers. Resize bar is what NVIDIA calls it, and AMD calls it Smart Access Memory, or SAM. Kind of one and the same. And what we do, or what we have as a result of that, is an integration of the CPU and GPU so they can communicate more quickly. Now, right now, everything seems to be game related, but as we look through this, and I'll show you what I know with the technology, how this goes, and no, I'm not going to enable it, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But right now, it's game related. But it looks like because of where it's going and what's headed down the road, this is going to be working on more than just games, but it looks like the applications are going to have to be written to be optimized for it. So first thing you got to have is the motherboard with the BIOS support. The second thing you got to have a video card that supports it. Okay, what video cards are going to support that? Right now, according to the specs, it's on the NVIDIA RTX series 30XX and above, and it's also enabled on the NVIDIA A series. Now, according to what I have read and what I know so far, a firmware update will be required for the consumer cards. On the professional cards, that feature is already enabled, and I've got some information I can share with you because apparently somebody has one of those cards and has that feature. Right now, the way it's done on an NVIDIA consumer card, or and this kind of gets into the driver because with NVIDIA, there's actually 3 different drivers. You've got on the consumer cards a game driver and a studio driver. And because of the work we do with content creation, we recommend the studio driver. Okay, on NVIDIA, when you go to a professional type card in the A series, that's not a game driver and that's not a studio driver. But as we talked about in a previous video, there is driver support for the A6000, which tells us that the resize bar option for the AMD Smart Memory Access Memory support is there. So as a shadow of things to come. Now, as we look at the machine we've built, we have 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. Right now, our GPU in this machine is a GeForce EVGA RTX 2080 Ti, 2 slots wide. What we'll have to do, because of the spacing, is put the RTX 3080 Ti back over here. Because we're doing all this testing, the cards are in the orientation they are for a reason and purpose, because the other cards we need to verify and test. So for us to enable this feature, since we can't do it, again to reiterate, on the RTX 2080 Ti, we have to go to the RTX 3080, which means change the orientation of the cards again. After this video, we've got some more to do on M.2 NVMe cards. So I'm going to show you what this is about. I'm going to tell you about how to enable it, but I'm not going to enable it. But I'm going to show you in the BIOS. Let's take a look at that. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, we're in the easy mode of the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare motherboard BIOS. So everything we're going to do is going to relate specifically to this motherboard. It says, and if you'll notice, it says BIOS version F4q, which means, as we look at the documentation, that's for the TRX40 Designare revision 1. Now, for the other 3 motherboards in this revision, of which there are 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, one of our subscribers in Germany just got back to me and said, what do you think I'm going to get? I said, well, my expectation, you're probably going to have revision 1.3. Goes to show. However, he has revision 1.1, which kind of surprised me. But the point of it being, he's got a different BIOS revision. However, his latest BIOS revision is in line with the date and the file size of the F4q, so this information will still be relevant to him, noting that with that BIOS information I've just shared, the same information is documented to have the same features enabled. That's the point. So all these details matter. It's a matter of what can we do, and after we've done it, where do we go with it? Okay, this is, we classify technology always as leading, bleeding, cutting, and trailing edge. Right now, I would put Resize bar in the classification of bleeding edge technology. It will become more mainstream. It will become more current technology. It will become less bleeding edge and more cutting edge as we go forward. Because remember, software is going to have to be apparently written to take advantage of it, because according to the list that I'll share with you, there's several games that have said you'll get, and documentation that says you'll get a 10 to 14% performance improvement with this integration. It's an extension of the PCI Express bus, which is different than the extension where you bridge two video cards together. That's completely different. This is free. This doesn't cost anything. It requires a motherboard BIOS that supports it, and it requires a video card that supports it, with possibly, have to qualify that, with possibly a firmware BIOS update to your video card. And each video card has different requirements. You'll have to check and see what you've got, see what's necessary. But from what I've read, they say don't do that BIOS unless you're going to enable that feature. Okay, that tells me and implies, kind of like when someone says your wiring is messy. Well, when we build a machine, we go through a smoke test. And after we do a smoke test and we do a video or we do proof of concept, then stuff comes out and we move on to the next video. As you guys know, we test a lot of stuff. So for me to set this up for this, I don't want to make that change not knowing what the ramifications might be of that firmware update to the BIOS of the video card. So for that purpose, and because of the other things we're doing, when I do that integration, I'm not going to keep that integration because there's 3 settings we need to make, and I'm going to show you. Okay, we're in the BIOS and easy mode. I'm going to go back to the F2. Okay, we're in advanced mode. We're under tweaker. We're going to tab over to settings. We're going to tab down to I/O ports, and we're going to tab down to Resize bar. The first thing we'll want to do is verify which slot our video card is in. And I say that to reiterate, our video card is not in slot 1. What happens, because of the prioritization of devices, it goes down the tree. 2 things happen in a BIOS. It goes down the tree to check where your video card's at, and it goes down the tree to check and see where your boot device is at. So because those 2 things are kind of generic and not that big a deal, I just leave the initial display output on PCI Express 1 because I may change it around again. The point of it is the BIOS will find it and it will boot from it. No big deal. However, when I enable this feature, it's kind of like when you enable the M.2 card for RAID. You got to set that manually. It can't be set to auto, although the documentation says it'll work. Maybe it will eventually. But while we're still in beta BIOS, that has to be set before. Okay. Same thing with the video card. We need to tell it what slot that video card is in so that we enable those other 2 features. Let's take a look. We're looking at number 1, the initial display output. So we need to identify that. But we happen to have an M.2 card in that initial slot. That's why it's not set to auto. Because our video card is actually setting on PCI Express bus 16_2 for auto bifurcation. Another reason I'm not going to change this right now, I move stuff around. Okay, under settings, right there, above 4G decoding. That's setting number 2 we need to put. Above 4G decoding, to give you a little history on that, that was for backwards compatibility for a 32-bit operating system. Can I see a show of hands for anybody running a 32-bit operating system? Anybody? Anybody out there running a 32-bit processor? Okay. We are all running a 64-bit operating system, even though it's not a real-time operating system, DPC latency, another video I'll talk about later. But in respect to what we are building, those settings are left off for backwards compatibility. If your video card is over 4 gigs, that needs to be turned on. However, when you install Windows, as we've gone through the process, you have to crawl before you can walk, before you can run. So when you initially install Windows, we're dealing with FAT32, and that's technology from 1996. The point of it being, there's no need to turn on 4G decoding until your system is up and running, or if you have something like an A6000, and if your system won't boot correctly, then go into the BIOS and turn that on so they can allocate and access that memory. So this is option number 2. Oh, and by the way, another thing while we're here, the above 4G decoding. Now we haven't done the video on this, but we've mentioned this before. If you install, say, a 4K capture card, you want to turn that on, because if you don't, you will get dropped frames in your capture. Say you're doing 4K 30, and if you happen to have a card that'll do 4K 60, you want to turn that on. But I got to say there's better ways and easier ways to do capturing than installing a capture card into a computer, and I'll get more into that another time. What we'll probably start with, because we've had a lot of requests about capture cards, so as the feedback has come in and as the questions have come into us, we have plans to do 4 different capture devices, 1 externally, 3 internally. The one internal that I like, that's my favorite for 1080, will work in a single lane slot, and then the other 2, actually there's 3, will work in a 4-lane slot. They're all PCI Express 2. But when you go to 4K, it's a big deal. So to reiterate, 4K capture, turn on above 4G decoding, and if you have a video card that has more than 4 gigs of RAM, after the operating system is installed, you can turn that on. If you have any adverse effects, go back and turn that off. But if you're not having any problems, leave it off. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. You will know when you need to enable it. But those are the 2 reasons to enable it. So number 3, and what this is all about, right there, Resize bar support. It's either disable or auto, so you'll want to turn that on. And again, I am not for the reasons I have outlined. I move stuff around. If I didn't move stuff around like we did, then that would be a different issue. But because of all the testing we do, I'm concerned about a BSOD, and because Thunderbolt is so finicky about what it takes to get that running with motherboard drivers, video card drivers, then the Thunderbolt drivers. And by the way, the Thunderbolt card has to have a revision done on the firmware, and it's very finicky about the driver it uses. Because of all that, I'm not going to enable this, but I'm telling you how, if you want to, and how to pursue it. And I've got some more information I want to share with you on some links that talk about it, as well as about the integration. And while we're at it talking about this, I think it's prudent and important that we take another look, while we're at the motherboard, looking at the Gigabyte website, on the CPU support. Right now, we're in the 3000 series processors, and we have 3 processors we can look at. Now, why is that important? Okay, the 5000 series of the Threadripper 3 has been announced that will be on the TRX40 Designare. Why is that relevant? For those that are building a machine that decide to do that, those processors, this is middle of July, should be available by middle of August. My expectation, there, number 1, maybe a BIOS update. Number 2, you're going to have an option for 3 other processors. All the resources are still the same, but I would expect a BIOS update may be required. If it is, we'll go through this again and talk about a BIOS update if you need that feature. For the rest of us, too early to tell, we'll have to wait and see. But based on this, I want you to take a look at what your options are. 3 processors. We're going to have 3 more processors. The 3000 series and then the 5000 series. Nice. And we'll have a link up for this, because if you'll notice, we've got here on the Threadripper 3990 F3 BIOS. Well, based on what we've got, F3, we're good to go. And that was when the AGESA code was updated to support the 3990. So I expect the next update for the 5000 series will probably update the AGESA code again. That's my expectation. We'll have to wait and see. Now, this information I want to share with you is on Gigabyte's website about Resize bar. And Resize bar is an optional PCI Express interface technology. Resize bar support is on and available for the Gigabyte RTX 30 series video cards. What is Resize bar? Resize bar is an optional PCI Express interface technology. As you move through a world in a game, GPU memory VRAM constantly transfers textures, shaders, and geometry via many small CPU to GPU transfers. So that's the reason for that integration, to make those things happen faster. Okay, if games support it, you know other applications are going to support it. But 10 to 15% performance improvement in a list of games. There's also some games that have a performance degradation. So it's a mixed bag. But it's a feature that I think they're going to need to be written for and optimized for. As a content creator, I can see this feature being enabled in time for us to take advantage of. And based on the specs and what we're working with right now, if Adobe stays on their game, which no, I don't use Adobe software, but I'm always looking at the technologies. Based on the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula, I would expect this to be a big deal with them, that they would want to enable in their software. How soon? I don't know. Bleeding edge technology? We'll see, but it's a shadow of things to come. Something to look forward to. So with the ever-growing size of modern game assets, the results in a lot of transfers using Resizable bar, assets can instead be requested as needed and sent in full, so the CPU can efficiently access the entire frame buffer. And if multiple requests are made, transfers can occur concurrently rather than queuing. Before enjoying the benefits of resizable bar, make sure the GPU, CPU, and motherboard are supported. Update to the latest game-ready driver. Okay, see, that says game-ready driver. That doesn't say a thing about the studio driver. It doesn't say a thing about the driver used by the professional. And I've got a link that will show you the A6000 support. Now, I have some more information that talks about the AMD cards and how that feature works. On the AMD consumer cards, you're going to have to go through this same issue. You may require a firmware update for the BIOS on the video card. However, on the professional cards that are coming out, that feature is supposed to already be enabled. We'll see. We first got to get our hands on one of those cards. Now, this talks about the GPUs in the video BIOS update for the GeForce RTX 30 series from Gigabyte. I have not checked the other vendors like ASUS or NVIDIA or MSI. This is not an all-inclusive. This is just to give you some idea of what's going on. And if you'll notice on the drivers for the 3080 Extreme 10G, which is the example Gigabyte gives, they show an F4, an F3, and an F2. And the BIOS update for the video card with F4 enabled add resize bar support. It gives the steps and procedures, and for more information, an NVIDIA Resize Bar firmware update tool, click on the link. So we're just telling you how it works, what we've got, and how to go down that path. If the questions come up that we need to do that, I'll do that. But once I do it, I want to be able to uncouple it so we can go back to moving stuff around. Because everything on the TRX40 Designare, since we have two 16-lane slots and two 8-lane slots, is about resource allocation. All the quad, I'll qualify, all the quad M.2 cards we have, most of them require a 16-lane slot. Some can work with an 8-lane slot. However, we're getting ready to do a video about M.2 cards, dual M.2 cards, because the question's about X570 chipsets. So because of that, we want to be able to keep a quad card in here as well as have a dual card in here. So that's why that's that way. So I hope that explanation helps. Okay, here's book and verse from AMD about smart memory access. They quote up to a 16% performance improvement. I said 15%. TechArt has a really good article about resize bar for AMD. And it talks, this is a nice little quote here. CPUs are traditionally limited to 256 megabytes of I/O memory address region for the GPU frame buffer. Think of it as a data dump for stuff like textures, shaders, and geometry, which I think is a good description. Since that data dump is limited to 256 megs, the CPU can only send texture, shader, and geometry data as and when the GPU requires them, which kind of is a bummer because that introduces some latency and that creates other issues, and there's other ways to get around some of that. So beyond the technology for the Resize Bar SAM support, there's other things that can be done to enhance those features, but I'm showing this as it relates to the BIOS, as it relates to us for content creation, because for those that do rendering, I think this is going to be a big bonus, but it's going to take time to have that feature enabled. Now remember, we're building 10-year machines, so my expectation, we should see better support for this very, very soon. If it's already in the Pro cards, it's just a matter of time before the software is written for it, optimized for it, to enable it. And I would expect applications to become Resize Bar SAM support aware. It should be an automatic thing. We'll have to see, but that's my expectation. NVIDIA has a tool that lets you, with games, enable that feature. I'll show you what that is in just a second. AMD had a tool, or there was a tool that could be used on AMD, but based on the date, I'm a little bit dubious about it. It's from a third party, so we'll have to see how that plays out. Apparently it's already there, or it's something you can do within the driver. Other things we're going to be getting into with the driver are going to pertain more to color and color rendering, 24-bit color, 8-bit, 10-bit. So you get rid of that kind of Moriarty effect when you have a lot of gradations of color, but that's another video. So that's where we'll head when we start talking about content creation and a monitor for content creation for rendering video. Now, to reiterate what I had said in a previous video, I went looking for the driver for the NVIDIA, and this is the NVIDIA Quadro Desktop Notebook Driver Release 460, and this has a date of 12/15/2020 for Windows 10 64-bit. It's a WHQL driver, but more significantly, the part that we want to know about, it's going to be optimized, and it's a driver for the Quadros, but it's also for the added support for the new RTX A6000. Not an RTX 6000, but an RTX A6000. So that's a big deal. That's not a game-ready driver, and that's not a studio driver. And that is the driver that's going to be required to enable that video card to work, and I expect we're going to have some buggy video drivers. So it's going to take a little time to flesh that out. And here's a real nice article from WCCF Tech that talks about the Resize bar option. Resize bar is available in the stock video BIOS for the NVIDIA RTX A6000 and will be available for the RTX 30XX series in March. All right, this is July. In short, Resizable bar removes the tight restriction on the amount of data that can flow between the CPU and the GPU memory, and can sometimes allow for substantial performance increases. Okay, that to me speaks volumes, because they're talking about substantial. Substantial to me is more than 15%. 10 to 15% is a good deal, but substantial tells me they know more than what they're saying, but they're not saying more until they have more information. So this is stuff we need to watch for. This also will be in the description for the bibliography for the video. Now, the new whiz-bang video card coming out from AMD is the AMD Radeon Pro, and a lot of information refers to the W6000 series. This is specifically a W6800. And as Shannon had pointed out, this card is now listed on Newegg. Questionable about the source, but give that time for more sources to become available. But the point of it being, there is the professional card, and that's going to be a 32 gig card. The first version I think is listed as an 8 gig, and I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Based on the formula for the memory that's on the card for rendering the 32 gig card. Price-wise, yes, it's expensive, but that's going to have SAM support, smart access memory. It's interesting too, if you'll notice here in the specs, it talks about optimizations for 6 Ultra HDR displays. I just kind of want to point out, at one time, and I believe Jack Hamilton was the last one that did this, we were looking at video cards probably about 6 years ago that had, and Ray Morris, output for 6 monitors. Those are the only 2 guys at Builder Buy who wanted that feature. I think Jack got to 4 monitors, and I think Ray Morris had 6 monitors, but only had 4 monitors installed. The point of it being, that feature left for quite a while, and now that feature's coming back, which I find kind of interesting. When you're doing video rendering, you've probably got 1 monitor, maybe 2 for your previews, and then you've got a different class of monitor, which is for content creation, not just for looking at video, but for rendering video. So you want something where you can do color matching, which we'll get more into, starting with an entry level, working our way up. But I wanted to point that out. Now here again is an article from WCCF Tech. This is dated April the 11th, and right now this is July of 2021. Here's how you can enable Resize bar support in any game via the NVIDIA Inspector. So you can check that out. And we've also got a link into Guru 3D for an application called Radeon Mod, previously known as AMD Registry Editor. I would expect as Resize bar becomes a bigger deal, we're going to see more applications that will enable this feature. Again, this feature has not been updated in quite some time, so I'm leery of recommending it, but I'm telling you about it because I know about it. We'll have to watch for something else. Now, quoting book and verse from NVIDIA, GeForce RTX 30 series performance accelerates with resizable bar support. And resizable bar utilizes an advanced feature of PCI Express to increase performance in certain games. As of March the 30th, and this is July the 15th, I believe, Resize bar support for GeForce RTX 30 series graphics cards and laptops. Okay, that's book and verse based on what they say publicly. But we have other information, as we talked about. First, I've shown you the driver again, that we're going to have support for this that's already enabled in the professional series cards, which is the RTX A series, which will be RTX A6000, RTX A5000, and RTX A4000, which is pretty cool. So a shadow of things to come, but again, bleeding edge technology. We'll have that link up as well. We've also got a link up into Microsoft that talks about system and driver support for resizable bar, and again talks about the 256 megabyte I/O region that acts like a frame buffer, so that we will be able to get past that. When you think about it, here we've done so much work to get our hands on PCI Express 4, one thing. Number 2, get our hands on PCI Express 4.0 video cards. And number 3, right now PCI Express 4 has been about the M.2 NVMe drives with a 2nd generation drive that can do 7,000 megabytes per second. Okay, with those 3 things, and now this one little thing that's going to do like this for this coupling, wow, doesn't cost anything. You got to have the hardware that supports it. And if you've got the motherboard and the BIOS and you've got the video card and the video BIOS for that, pretty cool. My point being, with all this stuff we've got going and multi-gigabytes of RAM in a machine, and we're hampered by a 256 megabyte buffer, wow. Yeah. So I'm on support with this. I'm on game for this, even though I don't do gaming. But yeah, I can see this is going to be a big deal. We're going to have to experiment with it and see what the benefits, pros, and cons are. It's going to be a lot of guinea pig. Let's see what happens. But I want to share with you what I know at this point, because we're marking a point in time as this goes forward. And this is, again, another one of those exciting technologies. But we have to see what everybody's doing and what this is all about. And if you'll notice here, it says for compatibility, which again goes back to the 4G decoding issue. For compatibility with 32-bit operating systems, discrete GPUs typically claim a 256 megabyte I/O region for their frame buffer, and this is how typical firmware configures them. On GPUs that support a resizable base address register bar, BAR, Windows will renegotiate the size of a GPU's bar after firmware initialization in the Windows Display Driver model, the WDDM, and later. And for more information about resizable bar, see the resizable bar capability specification in the PCI SIG specs library. Details matter. And what I like about this, from what Microsoft says, a GPU that supports resizable bar must ensure that it can keep the display up and showing a static image during the reprogramming of the bar. The display should not go blank and then back up during this process. It's important to have smooth transition between firmware displayed images, the bootloader image, and the first image generated by the kernel mode driver. There's a lot going on. Note that no PCI Express transaction will occur toward the GPU while the renegotiation is taking place. This renegotiation is mostly invisible to the kernel mode driver. When the renegotiation is successful, the kernel mode driver will observe that the GPU bar has been resized to its maximum size to expose the entire VRAM of the discrete GPU. Entire VRAM. Now, I don't know about you guys, that kind of blows my mind. A feature that we needed that we didn't know, but we're getting ready to get. All we had to have is a motherboard that supported it with a BIOS that supported it and a video card with a BIOS that supports it. And once that coupling is done, this is pretty wicked. My concern for the machines that we build, because we change stuff around a lot, I'm concerned about what might happen with the BSOD as it relates to Thunderbolt. So until I get a better handle and understanding about this, I'm glad to know about this and I know what to do, but I'm not sure yet I want to do it, and I'm telling you why. So for those of you that go down that road, if you get a BSOD, if you want to be the guinea pig, things like this are one of the reasons I always refer to Rick. And by the way, this is Builder By. Welcome. My name's Gil Boyd. I want to thank you for joining us. I like to refer to Rick, who's on the Gigabyte forums, because someone like him is smarter than I am, and he doesn't mind tinkering with stuff to that degree, because as he said, Gil, my system is not quite as heavily configured as yours is. So I'm going to let somebody else test this, because my goal is to get this machine up and running and so that we can be in production. Right now, we're still testing stuff. To me, this is all basic stuff, but this is all stuff that needs to be done, and that's why we're sharing it. So I want you to know where I stand and what's possible. And for those of you that want to try it, more power to you. I want to be the first guy to know about it, but I don't want to be the first guy to enable it. Does that make sense? Upon successful resizing, the kernel mode driver should expose a single CPU visible memory segment to the video memory manager. The video memory manager will map CPU virtual addresses directly to this range when the CPU need to access the content of the memory segment. So that gives you some idea of the what and the how and the why. And I've given you my take on the why not. Why not yet, let's say. We'll also have a link up to the NVIDIA Resizable Bar firmware update tool. And again, I would refer to the video card manufacturer, whatever you have, check with them, see what they say about this process. But there's the tool that is specific to NVIDIA. And there's a real nice article on Guru 3D about PCI Express resizable bar performance, AMD and NVIDIA benchmarks. And this is what I thought was most fascinating. Of the resizable bar tested, they used an NVIDIA RTX 3000 series and a Radeon RX 6000, not an RX A6000. So I want to point that out. But there's enough information there to make you get excited and to read the article for a better understanding. And I've got a nice little article that goes into Yahoo that talks about the AMD Radeon Pro W6000, which is series, which is actually the W6800. Workstation graphics with AMD RDNA 2 architecture and 32 gigs of memory. And if you've got a 32-core processor, that's a good match. However, on an AMD card, which you don't get, are CUDA cores, which we've talked about before, we'll talk about again later. If you want CUDA cores, it's NVIDIA. But if all you need is 32 gigs of memory to match that Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula, right there it is, 32 gigs. And I got to tell you, the more we talk about this, in other words, I mentioned that formula from Adobe, but as much as I appreciate the simplicity and the complexity because of the specificity of one, the processor to RAM, two, the processors to video RAM, I have a better understanding and appreciation for resizable bar SAM support, especially after I understand more about how this all works. This is phenomenal. I mean, this is something I think to get excited about. This is a big deal. Now, for those that do the gaming, because something beyond resizable bar to enhance performance would be Radeon Boost. I'll have a link up to that. I don't want to get into the details of it. But this can be found also on the Radeon RX 6000 series. Not just a Radeon Pro, but a Radeon. So we'll have a link up to the AMD Radeon Boost technology, which is specific to AMD for the Radeon RX 6000. So you've got Radeon RX and you've got Radeon Pro RX. Make that distinction. This is about the Radeon RX. And another technology AMD is working on is Radeon Anti-Lag. And that's one of the big deals about enabling the Resize bar feature, because you increase that buffer size. If you got a 32 gig video card, you open that all the way up to that full 32 gigs. That's, wow. We should see quite a performance improvement beyond 10 to 15%, but it's going to take time, I think, to be optimized for that. That's what it looks like. Now, we'll have to see how that plays out, but that's kind of my opinion right now. That may change once I enable it, but I need to see it both ways. I need more information. It's like the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know, and the more I need to know. And I know enough to know I need to know more, and I'm excited about what I know right now. So that's my take. And we've got a link up into Tom's Hardware about NVIDIA's reflex technology that beats AMD's Radeon Boost counterpart. And we'll also have a link up into AMD about the Radeon. One, the Radeon Pro, but also the Radeon RX. So this video has been about resizable bar, SAM, smart access memory on the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare with the BIOS update to enable SAM resize bar support. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I want to thank you for watching. Build or buy. My name is Gil Boyd. We're on to the next video. We're out.